I looked through the last 80 days. I know it's more than 80, but I stopped at 80, so anything that happened in the last 3 days I don't know about. And it just kind of got me really depressed, and I felt like there were no words. And so I will use somebody else's words. I'll use the words of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, organization started by the likes of Einstein and Oppenheimer. And as many of you undoubtedly know, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, founded at the height of the nuclear age, after we dropped bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was aimed at educating the public about the dangers that are posed by nuclear proliferation. And so they thought about, well, how are we going to communicate these dangers to the public who didn't have any idea? I mean, Truman himself didn't know that the bombs were going to be dropped on population centers until after they were. He thought they were strategic locations. So the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists came up with the Doomsday Clock, which some of you have seen, and you know, it's a symbolic, subjective thing, and it's mostly to just get people thinking. And they started the clock in the 50s at 7 minutes to midnight. And you know, midnight is, you don't want to be at midnight. And so recently, after the election, the organization added climate change to its consideration for how it should set the clock. And they set the clock, they moved it ahead, and so now it's as close to midnight as it's been since the 50s. So they moved it from 3 to 2.5 minutes to midnight. And here are their words. The probability of global catastrophe is very high. And why is it very high? Well, not only because of nuclear proliferation continues, you know, we have hair-trigger arsenals of 5,000 warheads apiece. We have threats of bioterror, we have threats of novel technologies like artificial intelligence, but mainly the move this time was because of the addition of climate change. And so the organization, when they announced this change, they indicated why the addition of climate change got them to adjust their estimate. And they noted that carbon emissions and concentrations in the atmosphere are currently higher than they've been in 650,000 years, soon to be 3 million years. Those emissions linger in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So we've, you know, essentially baked in certain changes into the atmosphere, regardless of what we do now. And they went on to discuss the various changes that are baked in to the atmosphere. And, you know, from the spread of disease to severe stress on various ecosystems, permanent inundation of coastal regions, relocation of hundreds of millions of people, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's in that context that we now face the first 80 days of the Trump administration. And you know, prior to the Trump administration, the world got together and they, you know, through the Paris Accords, they engaged in a bottom-up approach to trying to rein in carbon emissions. Each country, I think it's up to 178 of them now, each country has committed to what are called nationally determined commitments, NDCs. And if you add up all of these nationally determined commitments, that gives you what the world has currently committed to do, and to revisit those commitments every 5 years. And the goal is to ratchet up those commitments over time. So how do we take the climate crisis and link it to these commitments? Well, the IPCC, in its latest report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its recent report, it added a feature. It added what it called the carbon budget. The carbon budget is essentially all of the carbon emissions that we can still emit from now until 2100 and keep average global temperature increases within a desired level. That desired level is 2 degrees Celsius. Increasingly, people think it's 1.5. But we'll stick with 2 just to be cheery. And so the carbon budget indicates how much the world can continue to emit. And so from that carbon budget, you can extrapolate deadlines. You can extrapolate by what year the world, and by extension, individual countries, should approach certain cuts in carbon emissions. And so the carbon budget indicated that to likely keep average global temperature increases within 2 degrees, we're going to need to decrease carbon emissions by 40 to 70% by 2050 and to near zero by 2100. And so you take that decrease and you extrapolate deadlines. And so again, this is just to give us a slightly greater than 50-50 chance of keeping the average increase within 2 degrees, which most people think is not going to cut it for avoiding the worst of the effects. In order to do that, our deadline, extrapolated from the carbon budget, is net zero emissions by 2065. And if we want to keep the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, net zero emissions by 2045 to 2050. Again, that's just for a flip of a coin chance of the largest gamble that we may have as a species entered together. And so it's in that context that the United States, which has been regulating to some extent and addressing climate change since the 60s. I mean, a lot of people probably don't realize that, you know, like LBJ went on the floor of Congress and talked about how we have permanently changed the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels. And when, you know, the Clean Air Act was signed, it indicated that we had to protect, changes to the climate. And so in the context of a nation that from the 60s to today has haltingly and slowly been trying to do something to deal with this issue, you finally get to the Obama administration, which kind of takes LBJ on the floor of Congress full circle, and he basically says when he announced his own climate initiative that, you know, our children and our children's children are not going to look fondly on us if we don't act. And so he set out to use existing authority to do whatever was possible within the existing legal framework. Now, sadly, the existing legal framework that he set up through 5 pillars that I'll briefly go over, that only gets us to a point. If all 5 pillars were enacted, none of the legislation was stayed, or none of it was held up in court, if everything had gone according to plan, it still would have gotten us to a point where we would have had to double the rate at which we were reducing carbon intensity of our economy in order to meet the United States' nationally determined commitment for the Paris Accord. And remember, that's doubling our reductions in carbon intensity if we had enacted everything that had been set in motion during the Obama administration to put us in a position to meet our requirement, which combined with 177 other countries' requirements would fall short of keeping within the carbon budget. So that's the context in which Trump was elected, at least from the standpoint of climate change. And Trump comes in, and when he's not eating chocolate cake, you know, all these distractions that we hear about every day, And it didn't even look like good chocolate cake. You know, the cake that he told Xi that about the Tomahawk cruise missile strike over chocolate cake. He said it was the most beautiful chocolate cake. Anyway, if you look past these distractions, you actually find that he has been breathtakingly effective at something that he told Fox Business News yesterday, which is we're freeing it up. We're freeing industry up. He's absolutely right. And if you look at the 5 different pillars of Obama's approach to using existing authority to deal with the climate crisis, each and every one of those pillars has been dealt with already. It's been set in motion. So what are the 5 pillars? First, Clean Air Act, right, from 2011 and then reaffirmed twice by the Supreme Court after the Supreme Court in Massachusetts versus EPA held that carbon emissions and other greenhouse gases are pollutants under the statute. And if the agency makes an endangerment finding, then it must regulate first through motor vehicles, then Obama moved to stationary sources. So when you hear about the Clean Power Plan, the Clean Power Plan is EPA moving from motor vehicles to stationary sources, in particular the power sector. And the Clean Power Plan is focused in particular on existing power plants and setting standards for those. And that's pillar number 1. And pillar number 2 is fuel standards for motor vehicles, which was the focus of Massachusetts versus EPA. Pillar number 3 is energy efficiency standards for industrial equipment, appliances, federal buildings, and the like, which are scattered throughout federal statutes. Pillar number 4 is focusing in particular on methane, a particularly potent greenhouse gas, focusing on methane emissions from the oil and gas sector, especially from natural gas and fracking related activities. And the 5th pillar, which I'll lump a bunch of stuff together in, and you think about how the government treats information about climate change. So I would throw in this pillar things like the interagency working group that Obama's administration set up to determine what is the social cost of carbon emissions, right? So what is the damage over the life cycle of a ton of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? At the end of the Obama administration, the notion was the social cost of carbon was about $40 per ton of carbon equivalent. I would also lump into the information category the Council on Environmental Quality, which had issued guidelines several times, and most recently 2 years ago, about how should federal agencies address climate change impacts when they address environmental impacts generally under the National Environmental Policy Act. And so those guidelines were beefed up in 2015 and told federal agencies when NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, tells you that you have to consider environmental impacts through a long and public process, here are the ways in which you should consider climate change. You should consider the impacts of your project on the potential to speed up climate change, and you should also consider environmental impacts of your project in the context of climate change. So I would throw things like that into a 5th category of informational efforts. So all of that is just the context in which Trump is elected, and then he gets to work and he begins to dismantle all 5 pillars in 80 days. And, there are, one thing to keep in mind is what are the ways in which these activities are going on? And so if you wanted to put a little score sheet for the 5 pillars, how are they being attacked? Pillar number 1, Clean Power Plan. there was an executive order that did a couple of things. It told EPA to enter a new notice and comment rulemaking period, which will likely end in a version of the Clean Power Plan that mirrors something that Scott Pruitt proposed when he was Attorney General of Oklahoma, which will essentially set standards for existing power plants that are based entirely on energy efficiency within the facilities. So no longer looking at how facilities that operate within a grid can switch between different sources of fuels, like switching from coal to natural gas. So he's going to probably base the new rulemaking on solely what is the best, it's called heat rate, which is a fancy way of talking about energy efficiency within the facility. Or he may actually steer the rulemaking toward a realization of, oh my gosh, the statute is conflicting, and because it's conflicting, we don't have jurisdiction to regulate carbon emissions from existing sources. That's a possibility, and I can get into that in the Q&A. So pillar number one, we have an executive order that instructs EPA to engage in new rulemaking, instructs the DOJ to ask for the DC Circuit to hold existing litigation about the Clean Power Plan in abeyance. And so what we will get out of that is delay. And remember, in the years of delay, there's no regulation, and there's no striving to reach our commitments under the Paris Accords. And I think that, you know, in general, when you want to try to intuit where an agency is going when it issues a notice of proposed rulemaking, you look at the questions that appear at the front of the notice. And the notice in the Federal Register about reconsidering the Clean Power Plan has several questions. And they are there for a very refined and specific reason, and that is to set up a new set of data gathering to answer a new and different set of questions so that when the new rule is challenged, it is not arbitrary and capricious. And those questions are things like whether the rule is grounded in EPA statutory authority, whether the rule affects dual goals of the Trump administration of protecting public health and supporting economic growth, whether the rule provides benefits that substantially exceed costs. So that's pillar number one. Pillar number two is fuel economy. They've already issued a notice of intent to reconsider the next cycle of carbon standards for model years of vehicles. Pillar three, energy efficiency for appliances and equipment. They've already postponed half a dozen rules that they have decided to withdraw before they issue in the Federal Register, making it difficult to challenge. For methane emissions, they have a dual approach. Congress gets involved here. Some of you have heard about the Congressional Review Act. The Congressional Review Act allows you, Congress can try to rescind a rule that was passed up to 60 congressional days after the start of the new administration, and if the president signs it. And so for methane rules, the House has voted to rescind the methane rules for oil and gas on federal lands. The Senate has yet to follow suit, because the other thing about the Congressional Review Act is once you rescind under that statute, it's very difficult to pass similar legislation in the future. So some Western states are concerned that they're basically giving away the chance to have federal regulation of these activities for years to come. And so the dual approach is the Congressional Review Act for methane emissions from oil and gas on federal lands, plus another notice of proposed rulemaking to rescind new source performance standards for oil and gas of new equipment under the Clean Air Act. And then the fifth pillar is informational, and that's the easy one. Trump just has to rescind the affiliated executive orders, interagency working groups, every single report that they prepared. All of them were rescinded in executive orders. So the Council on Environmental Quality instructing agencies to consider climate change in a certain way, that was rescinded. Social cost of carbon, that was rescinded. There's no more interagency working group. The agencies in both of these cases are just left to decide for themselves. How do we price, if at all, the cost of carbon? What discount rate do we use? We don't know anymore. How do we consider climate change impacts under the National Environmental Policy Act? So, you know, that fifth prong, the easiest to tear down, but it does sow a lot of chaos in the mix. And, you know, I'm gonna turn it over to Sam in the not too distant future. I apologize for droning on. But everything I've said is just what he's done with regards to climate change. That's all and I haven't even said all of it. I've said maybe 2/3. And this is what I mean by breathtaking. So while all of this is going on, we also get signals about environmental protection writ large. We get signals about, well, clearly we have, you know, if you look at the last 50 years, this is the fifth time an administration has decided to have an assault on environmental standards. Thomas McGarity has a book called Freedom to Harm that you should read that details the first four of those cycles where administrations to varying degrees, combined with certain forces in the House, certain lobbyists, trade associations, think tanks, and the like. 4 times until now, they've tried to roll back standards. The interesting thing, if you read that book, is that the ways in which that happened, from the end of the Carter administration to you know, the Tea Party madness, they each had a select group of tools that they used to dismantle these things. You know, Reagan, when Gorsuch's mommy was the head of EPA, you know, he focused on the deconstruction of the administrative state in 2 agencies, EPA and the Department of Interior. This now is going on across the board, across the agencies, and it's using all of the tools that those 4 earlier cycles of deconstruction used. All of them are now being used at the same time. They're really seizing the moment. And so a couple of other themes that emerge beyond climate change. One, land is just totally being discounted. When you read materials you know, that are being released in these executive orders, they're constantly, and Trump talks about this in his interviews as well, they talk about, we're going to bring the agency back to when it focused on clean air and clean water. Land never seems to get mentioned, even though many of these statutes deal with land. And if you look at the budget proposal, the blueprint, you know, land-based environmental protection really suffers a blow, especially toxic waste cleanup. With regards to water, you know, since he wants to take us back to a time when the agency focused on water and air, there was another executive order that he signed that told the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers to begin work on a new clean water rule, which, you know, the EPA and the Army Corps recently finalized a rule to define what are waters of the United States under the Clean Water Act, because we had 3 different Supreme Court opinions, Riverside Bayview, Swank, and Rapanos, and none of them had resolved what counts as waters of the United States. Are wetlands next to rivers waters? And, you know, are wetlands next to a ditch that feeds into a stream? You know, really exciting questions like that that you can talk about with your friends. And so the Clean Water Rule that was issued recently was based on a review of all of the peer-reviewed science, 120,000 jurisdictional determinations that were made in this ambiguous period after Rapanos, and it tried to do the best it could to link the science to which of these waters actually affect the chemical, biological, and physical integrity of the nation's waters. And so, you know, there's another executive order that tells these agencies to scrap that. And here's the most important part. At the end of the executive order, it says, consider, that was nice of them, consider interpreting the term navigable waters as defined in a manner consistent with the opinion of Justice Scalia in Rapanos. And what that means is consider rewriting the rule to define waters under the Clean Water Act to not include a sizable portion of the wetlands and smaller streams, especially ephemeral streams in the West. And so that could dramatically rewrite the landscape for Clean Water Act authority. So I will just close for now by saying that all of this kind of put me in a mood, and I thought, well, how can I end this without just seeming ridiculous? And you know, several lessons came to mind when I was reading through what has been done in just 80 days. One of them is, don't mistake what is being done through executive action for changes in the law, right? Even some of these high-profile executive actions, they still leave all of the litigation, all of the enforcement of existing law to occur, right? If you rescind the Council on Environmental Quality's guidelines for considering climate change in environmental impact statements, it still doesn't change the fact that the National Environmental Policy Act requires you to consider direct, indirect, and cumulative effects of a project on the environment. And you know, on the flip side, don't lose sight of the fact that while all of this activity so far has been happening in the context of executive orders and notices of proposed rulemaking, that could change, because we don't know whether the legislative filibuster is going to go away. And if it did, it doesn't take much to decimate our most important environmental laws. Some of the environmental law professors at American law schools were morbidly emailing each other. How few words would it take to completely change the landscape? So let me give you an example. Imagine if you could only change 10 words in existing statutes and have a completely different scene when it comes to environmental protection. Here's what you would do. You would eliminate the words harm and harms from one provision in the Endangered Species Act. You would add the word direct in the National Environmental Policy Act. You would add subject to navigation in the Clean Water Act. You would add surface to one provision in the Clean Water Act. And you would add excluding carbon dioxide from one definition in the Clean Air Act, and it would be a completely different world. So one lesson is, you know, keep the eye on the prize, keep the eye on potential legislative moves. Second, everything I've talked about kind of excludes a lot of necessary reforms that we need to keep pushing for. We need a new Safe Drinking Water Act. You know, the way we treat lead in water is 25 years old. We need new regulations for preventing leaks from natural gas storage, like we saw in Aliso Canyon in California. So we need to focus on what is not being talked about, what is not being done. Next, remember what are kind of the firewalls, right? All of the activity with regards to climate change so far, Pruitt and the rest, have not said that they are going to eliminate EPA's endangerment finding, which is what was called for after Massachusetts versus EPA. That is the fulcrum upon which regulation of carbon emissions in under the Clean Air Act occurs. So as long as that's there, there is a requirement for the agency to address carbon emissions. And so that is an example of a firewall that we need to shore up. Next lesson from all this, find yourself some unlikely allies. There's a lot of groups that you should be working with that you might not immediately think about when it comes to things like climate change and environmental security. The military is among the most concerned about climate change of anyone, especially the Navy and the effects of sea level rise on their bases. Insurance companies, you could work for insurance companies. They have to deal with the effects of climate change on their portfolios. Independent assessor agencies that certify efforts to adapt to climate change. Pension funds, right? Some of us invest in certain pension funds that are heavily involved in fossil fuels. Well, there is such a thing as the carbon bubble that will eventually burst, and what will that do to pension funds? So you could work for a pension fund and deal with risks affiliated with climate change and the carbon bubble, and on and on and on. Next lesson is, the states might be where it's at, but I don't think they're going to do enough to fill the gap left from federal inactivity, and especially if you look at the left coast, Washington, Oregon, and California, they all have different approaches to climate change, but they're all particularly ambitious, and so we should keep an eye out for those and whether they serve as a model for elsewhere. And finally, sweat the big stuff, right? I did not yet mention the fact that the ozone ambient air quality standards are going to be revisited and perhaps relaxed, and that could result in the most human health harms of anything that I've talked about already. And as another example of big stuff, if you look at that budget blueprint, there are entire arguments and approaches and themes that blueprint is zeroing out, right? So environmental justice, Office of Environmental Justice gone, Environmental Justice Programs gone, climate research zeroed out. The Office of Research and Development in EPA is the premier environmental health research organization in the country. And when Richard Nixon signed the Reorganization Act that created the Environmental Protection Agency, it was research that was one of 3 themes that he stressed were going to be important for the agency. And so, focus on those themes that seem to be driving efforts to zero out parts of the budget. And then finally, some of these environmental organizations since the election are now flush with cash. Giving is way up at places like the Sierra Club. And so there might be a mood to throw the occasional Hail Mary. And so there might be more bandwidth to attempt certain legal strategies and theories that heretofore might have seemed just the stuff of academic articles. So, a couple that come to mind, of course, are Juliana versus the United States, which is, can we use the public trust doctrine to get the federal government to act on climate? And another one is using the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act to say things like, hey, Exxon, you're not planning for sea level rise as it could affect your oil terminals. You have created an imminent and substantial endangerment because you haven't done that, and we're going to sue you under a statute that never dreamed that that was a situation that would emerge. So there's a lot of work to do, but I'm not going to lie, there's a lot to worry about, and it's going to be heavy lifting getting us back on track to have a fighting chance at greater than 50-50 at keeping within what the scientists, I know we're downplaying scientists nowadays, but what the scientists tell us we need to do in the next 50 years.
So I'll talk briefly about human rights, international human rights, and of course that's what Greg has been doing, even if he didn't use the label. Climate change, I think, is one of the most profound human rights issues of our time. And human rights organizations now recognize this, and they're gearing up to deal with it. The UN Human Rights Council has this on its agenda. And if we don't get climate change right, the rest of human rights will be moot. So that is it's an area that actually frightens me most. So we've had many wonderful talks, and they're in many ways actually all been on human rights, or some aspects of human rights. So I will not recanvass much of the ground that has been covered. We'll instead just focus on the global or international human rights dimension. I know a lot of the other talks have concentrated in the United States scene, but I think we need to look at the global aspect. As a colleague of mine at Human Rights Watch remarked to me the other day, he said, we're gearing up to deal with the US scene, but we must not forget that we're in 90 other countries. So that is a major consideration. So I'll do that, and we need to look at this in the context of the human rights movement, the modern human rights movement, and then maybe try to figure out what we can do about this. So looking at the global aspects of the current human rights scene and the new administration, and putting it in the context of what's going on around the world. As the just released 2017 Human Rights Watch World Report points out or highlights, the greatest global challenge for human rights at the moment is the rise of populism, and not only in the United States, but in Europe and throughout the world. And in its current form, as Ken Roth describes it, this is the case of politicians who claim to have special knowledge of what the majority wants, and who claim that this majoritarian will should trump the rights of minorities, various minorities, whether it's refugees or immigrants or asylum seekers and so on. This kind of populism also appeals very often to racism, xenophobia, nativism, misogyny, and it also sees human rights as an obstacle to achieving whatever the majority wants, or whatever it claims the majority wants. In the context of the people feeling discontent with the status quo, and there are many other aspects of the current scene that cause people discontent. Many feel left behind in the West, for instance, by technological change, the global economy, growing inequality. Some worry about horrific incidents of terrorism generating apprehension and fear, and some are uneasy with societies that have become more ethnically, religiously, or racially diverse. And so there is, and of course, there is the overall feeling that the governments and the elite ignore public concerns. And so populists claim that the majority want rights violated in the name of securing jobs, avoiding cultural change, protecting against terrorism. And they suggest that the strong man is the one who can deliver best. The US scene in this aspect has been addressed in other legal launches, but the phenomenon and the challenge is global. In some parts of Europe, racism and anti-Semitism are on the rise, and the situation sometimes resembles the 1930s. And a similar trend can be found outside the West. Indeed, the rise of Western populism seems to have emboldened several leaders to intensify their flouting human rights. The Kremlin, for instance, has eagerly defended Putin's authoritarian rule as no worse than the West's increasingly troubled human rights record. China's Jinping, like Putin, has pursued the toughest crackdown on critical voices in decades. President Erdogan of Turkey took advantage of a recent coup attempt to crush his opposition voices, and you know that in a few days, on the 16th, there is a referendum in Turkey to adopt a draft new constitution that will concentrate more power in his hands. President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines has openly called for summary executions of suspected drug dealers and users and even human rights activists who defend them. Prime Minister Modi of India tried to shut down critical voices as he closed his eyes to intimidation and hate crimes by Hindu nationalist groups. And you find in the midst of this, of course, Syrian President Assad, backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, has basically shredded the international laws of war. And several African leaders are at it, who are feeling vulnerable to domestic or international prosecution, trying to dismantle the International Criminal Court, although so far they haven't had much success. We had Burundi, whose leader actually has good reason to worry about prosecution, announcing that they are withdrawing from the ICC. Gambia also said that they were doing it, but of course the brutal previous regime was defeated and the new leader has recommitted the International Criminal Court. Zuma in South Africa was also threatening, actually tried to withdraw, but has been thwarted by the courts, at least for the moment. So this is a global trend, and it is a major challenge that we need to deal with. Of course, some of the impacts of the United States, I think last week there was talk about women's rights, which, like climate change, don't make for pyrotechnics that produce good television programs, but nevertheless have very, very profound consequences. And so global funding, for instance, in relation to reproductive health and the gag rule, which says that you cannot talk about abortion. If you want to put this in context, of course this is not the first time this has been tried, but if you look at previous versions, they would have restricted or cut funding by 575 million. The current version, the current Trump version, will restrict and cut up to 9.5 billion. And we are talking about foreign aid for health programs, including family planning, HIV, TB, malaria, maternal mortality, and so on. And then you add on to that the end of global funding for one of the most important global women's health agencies, the United Nations Population Fund, which again provides leadership in working against restrictive environments around the world for women's rights, from preventable maternal deaths to female genital mutilation to child marriage. So we are looking at a pretty gloomy situation. But to put this in the context of the human rights movement, in December we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And those two important treaties, of course, together with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, make up what is traditionally known now as the International Bill of Rights. The International Bill of Rights, of course, started with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which had its humble beginnings in Eleanor Roosevelt's Washington Square apartment, where she and Charles Malik from Lebanon and Chang from China and the first director of the Division of Human Rights, John Humphrey, just met at a tea party, basically, and started the drafting process that produced the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Declaration here some time ago, and the proceedings were published in the Brooklyn Journal of International Law. And one of our speakers was Lou Henkin, who said that human rights was the idea of our time, talking about what an amazing revolution the human rights movement has been. A dramatic revolution post-1945 that has produced, in addition to the International Bill of Rights, but an amazing body of human rights. Now, of course, a lot of that was overshadowed by the Cold War, although since the end of the Cold War, there was a window where we seemed like democracy was thriving and human rights were coming into their own in spite of setbacks like the genocide in Rwanda and so on. But the last 10 years seem to be seeing a reversal of these trends. And so it is a bit of a worry. But there have been some important successes. And I'll just mention one, for instance, the movement involving LGBT rights and gay marriage, which is in fact a worldwide trend. Of the wealthier countries, Australia is still an outlier, but it is moving. New Zealand was there before. Actually, the debate in New Zealand was very interesting. There was a member of parliament who was in support of gay marriage was speaking, and this woman who opposed it was interrupting him. And she said, she was a very right-wing fundamentalist Christian. She said, "You're going to burn in hell for eternity." And the guy said, no. You see, I have a degree in physics, and I've checked out the temperature of the furnace, and I know my body composition. Said, it will be over in a couple of seconds. It was really, really fascinating debate. But to end on a fairly optimistic note, we need to realize that for most of human history, there was no such thing as human rights. People lived under horrible things. It was, in fact, what we call misogyny, racial prejudice, intolerance, segregation, torture, slavery. Those were the norm, not the exception. And so we've come a long way. And we are dealing with a very fragile set of values. But nevertheless, I have a lot of optimism. And some of that optimism come from personal experience. I remember I've lived under some horrible human rights situations, and I was a refugee myself. But I know that we've come a long way. And finally, I have a lot of confidence in you guys. Like Greg, there is much that we can do. We have institutions, we have NGOs, we have the courts, we have, so there is a reawakening, and there is a growing movement that's resisting the rollback of the progress that we have. But it's important that we all rise up and vigorously reaffirm human rights and remind people that violating the rights of some minority groups that may be unpopular at the moment may result in violations of rights of everybody at some point. I think I'll leave it there, and we'll take some questions. But I have
Just to recap, for nearly all of human history, things were terrible. We have this very brief moment, and then climate change will kick in, and that's just tie it together.
How much faith do you have that the private sector will press on, the private energy sector will kind of, regardless of the administration, transitions to green energy economies will happen? You hear there's even people in the Freedom Caucus that want to end oil subsidies that don't like the idea we're doling out corporate welfare to the oil industry. So, it looks like there's some kind of bipartisan effort to end certain subsidies in the energy economy. Are you optimistic that even under this administration you'll see, at least, green energy production will increase in a lot of areas of the country?
Yeah, no, great question. I think it's the right question, so good job. Already certain sectors of the economy have the capacity to, I'm thinking about like the Western Interconnect. You think about the national power grid. The Western Interconnect already has enough natural gas and clean energy sources for electricity to replace all coal-fired power plants in that region. And you know what's interesting about these executive orders? They fail to realize something that you astutely pointed out, which is that these sources of energy compete with each other. And so in the same sentence sometimes, Trump will talk about saving the coal miner while he makes it even easier for natural gas companies to compete. And you know, that's the true source of the decimation of the coal industry, is the rise of natural gas and horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. So the idea of corporate America picking up the slack has its limits, right? I think, I don't know what it's called, it just came out, Bloomberg just came out with a book with the former head of the Sierra Club, and they're both on the cover staring off into the distance, which kind of made me ill, so I didn't buy it yet, so I don't remember what the title was. You know, that they look like Marvel superheroes like this. And
it's like a climate of change or something.
now I will not buy it, if that's the real title. But you know, you know, the critique of the book that has already been lodged before it came out was that the book is essentially a blueprint for, you know, to what extent corporate America can pick up the slack. You know, I've been working with a group of researchers on a book called Legal Pathways to Decarbonization, which was going to come out when Hillary Clinton was elected, and we were rushing to finish it as kind of a blueprint for everything you would have to do legally to encourage the business sector to decarbonize. And now we're taking our sweet time finishing it because no one will care. So it'll be more accurate but less read. So, but you know, in the course of working on that book, you learn about things such as the efficiency paradox, which means that corporations will get to a certain level of energy efficiency, whereafter you really need to price carbon, which is the real answer to a lot of this. If we had a carbon tax that was, you know, cross-sector, that would do most of what Obama was, you know, cobbling together in these 5 pillars. And so you find that you really need the price of carbon to go beyond $40 to $50 a ton to get certain efficiency efforts moving, and you need it to go all the way up to $200 a ton to encourage things like carbon capture and sequestration, which is the only way that you make coal-fired power plants doable under these circumstances. And so there has to be a role for that kind of top-down pricing to encourage the business sector to fill that gap. And that's what we will not have. So yeah, so clean energy, the green energy transition is here to stay. The question is, how delayed will it be? Will it happen in time? And what leadership position, if at all, will we have at or near the front of that transition? But the transition is inevitable.
You were talking before about there being greater room for creative legal strategies for these nonprofit organizations. How does that factor in with the delays that you were talking about the clean power plant? Like, there's room for creativity, but nothing's moving. How does that relate?
Right. Yeah, great question. And I was trying to end on a positive note. That's what was happening there. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't to suggest that you can represent children and future generations in litigation in Oregon and claim that the government isn't living up to its public trust responsibilities and hope for that to make up for 50 years of slow to no action. You know, but the point is that, you know, for things like the revisiting of the ozone standards, which of course ozone contributes to tens of thousands of injuries a year in terms of heart attacks and lung disease and things like that. That's an area where we need creative litigation that will ensure that these rollbacks don't happen. And so, keeping your eye on sources of legal authority that haven't been dismantled or that the administration has already signaled would be difficult to impossible to dismantle. There's a lot of work to do there. And there's a lot of work to do with regards to how these statutes intersect with novel problems, right? I mentioned RCRA, which is a solid waste management statute, and who would have thought that use of solid waste could create earthquakes, and now that's a thing. And so now the question is, how do you argue that that statute can kind of align with the situation of creating a substantial endangerment through the use of solid waste creating earthquakes? So, so there's plenty of opportunities, and my suggestion was just that some of the mainline organizations might have more bandwidth to tolerate them. And with regards to areas of administration that are being zeroed out, like environmental justice, I mean, there's going to be a need for creative lawyering there. Right before the end of the Obama administration, there was a request to investigate the goings-on in Flint as a civil rights violation, right, under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And so it'll be important to focus on how that plays out. There's already been one Civil Rights Commission that kind of issued a 100-page report detailing the civil rights violations in Flint. The next 10 Flints are already identifiable. There's one in Indiana that asked for a state of emergency where the entire water supply is currently contaminated with lead, and Governor Pence declined. And so, there is room for important work, but none of this important work can make up for the loss of the kind of top-down, cross-sectoral regulation that something like the Clean Power Plan was trying to do. I mean, if you just look at something like the Clean Power Plan as an intellectual achievement, it's pretty astounding how it kind of cobbles together all we've learned about the provision of power to a society in one place. And a lot of that coordination that took place gearing up for the Clean Power Plan, those networks are still in existence. And those ties still exist, and so, tapping into some of those, and I'm happy to talk to you about how you could do that, it would be one way to kind of just join the movement as it's progressing.